Chapter 15, Section 2 discusses some of the evidence for evolution. The first thing that we'll look at is biogeography, which refers to the geographical distribution of species. The second thing is the fossil record, and with that, figuring out types and orders of fossils, so being able to get an age. The third piece of evidence are homologous structures, which show that there was a common ancestor. The fourth thing is comparative embryology, and this is a little bit newer field. This is the study of structures that appear during embryonic development and the comparison of those between species. And then the last part, and probably the newest, is molecular biology, which is where the actual DNA, RNA, and proteins are analyzed and compared between different species. So back to biogeography, that's basically just tells us that new organisms are going to arise in the same geographic locations where their ancestors lived. So, for instance, the example here is kangaroos live only in Australia. So we're only going to find kangaroos in Australia, but that does also help us to look for fossils of that type of ancestors that would live there as well, and kind of narrow down the area where we could trace back their ancestors. The second piece of evidence is the fossil record, and this is probably the most convincing piece of evidence before molecular biology. And fossils are just impressions of organisms from the past that have been mineralized in rock. They could be, plants, animals, bacteria, and we can use that fossil record then to do a comparison to see what kind of links there are between these modern versions and what their ancestors look like. The distribution of fossils follows the law of superposition, which means that the lowest layers of rock, or strata, are the oldest, and so the fossils that are in those lowest layers are going to be older than fossils that are in the higher layers of rock, or newer layers. So we can get what's called a relative age, which is just kind of a comparison of this is older than that type of age. We can also use radiometric dating to figure out an absolute age as well, which would give you a true number value of how old something is, as opposed to just the relative age that compares. So looking at these fossils, you can see similar structures and form. You can also see where the organism went extinct, if it did. So you'll see it for a while in the fossil record, and then all of a sudden it no longer is there. Well, it probably went extinct. And then the difference between an extinction and a mass extinction. With a mass extinction, that's a relatively brief period of time where you have a large number of species disappearing. So not just one individual type of species, but a whole lot of them. And the last mass extinction that you're probably familiar with are the dinosaurs. Homologous structures are the next piece of evidence for evolution, and what homologous structures are pieces of anatomy that have different functions but a similar structure. So, for instance, the forelimbs of organisms. Here's a little bit better picture. This is a turtle, a human, a horse, a bird, a bat, and a seal. Obviously, our forelimbs on the outside look very different. Our arm looks a lot different than a bird wing, but you can see from the colors here that they have the same types of bones inside of them. So their internal structure is the same, but their outside look and function is different. So those are homologous structures, and that shows that there has been a common ancestor that must have had these same bones as well in order to pass those on to these future generations. This is just a picture of a skull. We've got a chimp and a human. Now they have similar regions and structures. Another type of structure is called an analogous structure. Now these ones are almost the opposite of homologous. These ones actually look similar and have a similar function, but inside they're different. So like a bird wing and a insect wing, inside of those wings they're completely different. Their anatomy is not the same, but on the outside they both look like wings, and they both help the organism to fly. So they would be analogous structures. And the last type of structures are vestigial structures. These are ones that an organism has that has little or no function, but must have had a function in an ancestral species. So they're no longer useful to us, but our ancestors must have used them for something. So for instance, with humans, we have a tailbone, but we don't have a tail. So we don't really need a tailbone. Also our appendix. Okay, if you get a bad infection in your appendix, you can have that removed, and that's not a problem. So it is a structure that we do not necessarily need in order to survive. In this diagram here, this is a type of whale, and you can see this small section of bone here. That's actually pelvic bones. Well, you don't need pelvic bones unless you have legs and can walk. So this organism does not need those. The fourth piece of evidence is called comparative embryology. And basically what is done here is a comparison between different species embryos. This picture is showing different vertebrate embryos as the stages that they go through from when they're first formed to birth. And there are a lot of trends, and then they grow more different from one another the closer they are to birth. So here we've got a fish, a reptile, a bird, and a human. You can see that they all look very similar. They all have tails, and they all have gill pouches, okay, which we are not all born with gills or tails, so those eventually are go away before we're actually born. But the more closely our embryos resemble each other for a longer period of time, then the more closely related we are. And the last one is molecular biology, and this is, like I said, probably the newest field, and this is also the most direct analysis. So this is the most accurate. There are no assumptions here like there have to be sometimes when comparing anatomy or comparing fossils. With molecular biology, you simply take a DNA, RNA, or protein sample and you compare those samples. The more similarities there are, the more closely related two species are to each other, and the more differences there are, then the more different they are from each other. So it's pretty cut and dry. There's no assumptions that need to be made, and it's not like with the fossil record, that can be incomplete sometimes. Not every organism leaves a great fossil behind. So with molecular biology, that really helps in the accuracy of comparing organisms to one another.